Signore e signori, buonasera. Buonasera, benvenuti alla casa italiana zerilli-marimò della New York University. We are delighted to be part of this marathon dedicated to contemporary Italian literature and translation. It's a series of events, and thanks to those of you that persisted until the end. And it's a great pleasure to welcome back to the casa an old friend, Maria Ida Gaeta, who is one of the curators, along with Cathe Giffuni, Maria Gliozzi, and a long list of Italian institutions in New York, from the Italian Cultural Institute, all the universities and colleges around here. It's great that we find a common goal, that is to talk about Italian literature, what is happening today in the Italian literary scene, and also translation. The course I'm teaching right now is on cultural diplomacy, and one of the topics that we develop, and we had Luigi Ballerini talk to my students, is translation as a form of cultural diplomacy. Translation builds bridges, and the name of the award is Bridge. Bridges that are needed today more than ever. So we are very grateful to all of you that work in the publishing world as writers and as translators, and we have a great panel tonight. Tonight's the last event of your marathon is dedicated to Cesare Pavese, a great Italian author to whom we dedicated many different events. And every time I talk about Cesare Pavese at the casa, I'm not gonna, because there is plenty of people that are gonna do it after me. But I'm moved by the fact that Cesare Pavese's greatest dream was to come to the US and teach Italian literature here. So when we do something like this, we are basically making his dream come true, a dream that he couldn't realize in person, but I believe that in some way what we do and what we're doing tonight in particular is fulfilling his desire that could never be fulfilled. And of course there is a further element of joy and pride for me. My dear colleague and very trusted friend, Julian Sachs, is one of the translators. He normally is relegated to the projection room. Tonight he's going to be on the stage with a jacket. That's the event in the event. And we have a message from the president of the Fondazione Cesare Pavese, Luigi Vaccanio, and after that, Eugenio Refini, the chair of our Department of Italian Studies, is going to take over and moderate the panel. Thank you all again very much for being here.
Good evening, everyone. I am Pierluigi Vaccanio, director of Fondazione Cesare Pavese. I would like to begin by thanking Stefano Albertini for the cultural work carried out with Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò, and for his constant attention to one of the most important authors of the 20th century, Cesare Pavese. I should have been with you, but unfortunately a series of institutional commitments have kept me in Italy, much to my regret. I hope to return soon to what is also the American home of Cesare Pavese. I believe that tonight's event is of great importance because it is dedicated to two of the texts that best represent Cesare Pavese's intellectual activity, The Craft of Living and The Dialogue with Leucò. We know that Pavese himself considered Dialogues with Leucò his most important book, the one he believed would be the least understood, yet the one that more than any other would serve as a mirror in which Pavese and each of us might recognize ourselves. And since I am in my office, I can show you the original copy of Dialogue with Leucò, on which Pavese left his last words. And it's always very touching also for me. This book was saved from the flood that struck northern Italy in 1994, and today it's one of the most representative volumes preserved in our museum, alongside other first edition manuscripts and books that belong directly to Cesare Pavese. The Dialogue and The Craft of Living, though very different from each other, in my view represent Pavese the man in dialogue with Pavese the writer. In the dialogues, this idea is more evident. If we read the 27 dialogue from this perspective, we find Pavese the man reflecting reflected in Odysseus, attempting to overcome fate by living in the past and seeking in the journey the immortality that Calypso, Pavese the writer, offers him in the moment of artistic success. Or maybe his Orpheus would realize how mistaken it was from an existential point of view to chase after Pavese the writer an ephemeral dream of social authority, but a condemnation, an evil destiny. Or again, in the dialogue The Bull, Pavese arrives at the awareness that his own destiny does not betray, not by killing his Minotaur, but by engaging in dialogue with it. Here perhaps lies the summary of the entire work, a dialogue between Pavese and his own shadow, between a man in search of his voice and the writer who has silenced that voice. Non parole, un gesto, non scriverò più, we read in the final page of The Craft of Living. Here, Pavese the man prevails. After a life devoted to intellectual work, he claims his destiny with a gesture, human and tragic, that leaves the writer, like Euridice, in the underworld, in order to seek his own human immortality in the eternity of his Odyssean journey. But I would like to conclude with one of the lines that I believe best represents Pavese's work, also taken from the Craft of Living, and which leaves us with the idea that our life, like Pavese's, must always be a new discovery, a new journey, a new dawn, a new moon be seen in all its phases, as happened a few days ago to four astronauts who made all humanity dream. L'unica gioia al mondo è cominciare. È bello vivere perché vivere è cominciare, sempre, ad ogni istante. The only joy in the world is to begin. It's beautiful to live because to live is to begin always, at very moment. Warm greetings to you all, with the hope that we will meet again on this or the other side of the sea. And congratulations to Julian Sachs, to my great friend Iuri Moscardi, and to Minna Zallman Proctor for their important work on Pavese. And thanks again to Stefano and Casa Italiana for being the home of all our Italian culture.
Okay, here we go again. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Stefano, for the introduction. And I think, this final few words on the video, I think it resonates significantly with several things we have covered today. This idea of life as a constant beginning. We were hearing earlier about the idea of even translation as something which continues to be in the making, or something which should conceived as constantly in the making, and then the relationship with the original, which instead seems to be a little more stable. All these kind of questions are certainly relevant to the two works we are discussing tonight. I'm kind of an interloper because I'm not a Pavese specialist, but I'm of course Pavese lover, as many of us. So I will make the most of the sort of expertise of our presenters, and I won't really venture into coming up with crazy things about Pavese. Still, I have a few questions, and hopefully we will get there. So tonight, as we have already heard, we are here to discuss and celebrate the publication of two recent translations of two very important works by Cesare Pavese: Il mestiere di vivere, The Craft of Living, edited by Iuri Moscardi and translated by Julian Sachs, and the Leucothea Dialogues, Dialoghi con Leucò, translated by Minna Zallman Proctor. The Craft of Living came out with University of Toronto Press in the Da Ponte Italian Library, which of course is a venture to which Casa Italiana is very connected, and I'm very glad that Professor Ballerini, who's the director of the series, he's here with us. The Dialogues instead came out with Archipelago Books. Of course, both venues are extremely important when it comes to translating Italian works into English, and they have done so much for widening the variety of books which we can now read and even teach. And I would like to go back to this point in English at this point for our regular pedagogical endeavors. I won't spend much time in introducing the guests, the speakers. One of them is not even a guest, actually, is a host. So, I will begin with Julian Sachs. He's the program director here at Casa Italiana, but also a colleague in the department. He teaches for the department a very successful course, Night at the Opera, which I think is becoming really one of our blockbusters courses, and an opera lover. He's done so much for that art form, but in this particular occasion, he will wear a different hat. No pun intended. I think the three of us actually share.
We have the same barber.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes, let's put it that way. Or the need to have the same kind of hats, right? So Julian is the translator of Il mestiere, vivere, and he has been working together with Iuri. So Iuri, is the Pavese expert in the room, in the sense that Iuri, who holds a PhD from, our fellow friends up there at the Graduate Center at CUNY, has been working on many aspects of modern Italian literature, but Pavese is undoubtedly, the backbone of his work. And he's been very active both over here and in Italy, working on Pavese. And also, beyond his scholarship, which of course is extremely important, I would like to stress the fact that Iuri has always been very interested in trying to reach out to broader audiences, also with publications which have been talking to people beyond academia. And this continues to be extremely important, both here and in Italy, of course. Now, with Minna Zallman Proctor, we have a writer and a translator. So, we continue with this question of what it means to be bridging across these two activities. I won't list the titles of our books because we have a long list, and we have links to the bios of our three speakers on the website, so please go and check them out. But I would like to insist on the fact that Minna has been really, I think, she embodies this notion of going back and forth from one thing to the other. Of course, she's also a professor of creative writing, and so she also feels those shoes, the idea of how to teach. And perhaps one side question which might come up later is, what happens when a writer and translator, ends up teaching, of course, and perhaps teaching both. How those kind of different hats kind of get together in her work. So I would like to begin with a question for each of you, which is really about your connection with Pavese, as an icebreaker, as if we needed one. But I would be curious to hear, what is your, let's say, first encounter with Pavese, and then specifically what brought you to these two projects, I Dialoghi and Il mestiere di vivere.
Want me to start? For me, I was familiar with Pavese mostly for his most probably well-known work, La Luna, I Followed the Moon and the Bonfires. And when Luigi approached me to collaborate with Iuri on this, I was not familiar with the Mestiere di Vivere, and it was fascinating to get to know this person who operated in a cultural sphere that I was familiar with from my college days. Mostly, I was focused mostly on works by his contemporaries like Calvino, like Fenoglio, and so my approach was this, getting to get a little bit behind the scenes in a certain sense, because a book like The Craft of Living really accesses a different Pavese than the one that you might be used to if all you've read are the sort of straightforward narrative novels, or the poetry for that reason.
Oh, I go. Okay. So as Eugenio was saying, yeah, my connection, let's say, with Pavese originated years ago when I was still in Italy at the university. And you, Eugenio, before mentioned the relevance of Pavese for teaching, so as at the pedagogical level. And my encounter with Pavese was totally random. And it happened at university, so never underestimate your professors. So I took this class of Italian literature, and we have to read La Luna e i Falò, so The Moon and the Bonfires. And I don't know, I felt this deep personal connection with, some of the stories, the past, the kind of places that are described in this novel. And from that, my passion originated, so I wrote both my theses, bachelor and master thesis on Pavese. And then I also, analyzed some Pavese in my dissertation too. And I realized more and more I think about it that I am very fascinated by Pavese as a translator, so as a messenger, as a, carrier of meaning of words between one culture and another culture. And when Luigi offered me this opportunity, I was extremely, extremely happy. So that's the origin of my passion or obsession.
It's on? Yeah. It's on? It's very on. But as with many things in my creative life, I come to Pavese through my mother, and she was obsessed with Pavese, and she was a composer and set his texts, several texts, to music. One which fascinated me because she set the text, but there's no vocal part. So she was very engaged with his work, and the dialogues in particular was a book that she was completely consumed by, such that in my mind I see her carrying around her little, tascabile, her little beat-up copy for like 4 or 5 years, trying to make sense of it. She would read one at a time and pore over it and try to figure out what it was about. And so I have a very vivid image of her spending years reading this book. And so when I was in conversation with my editor, who is up there, hi, and we were talking about different projects, this one came to me. Little did I know that I would also spend 5 years trying to figure out what in the world any of it was about. But the connection is really through her and her interests.
Fantastic. Thank you. I mean, each of these stories would deserve much unpacking, but in the interest of time, perhaps, of course, most people here are familiar with Cesare Pavese, and I'm sure that perhaps 99% of the members here tonight of the audience have read Il mestiere di vivere and perhaps the Dialoghi. Let's imagine that perhaps someone is new to these two books. These are peculiar books because, I think as we heard in the video earlier, it is true that Pavese clearly had a strong attachment to both. And they can certainly be considered among the most important books of a collection of works, which is all most important, right? But certainly the big audience is more familiar with the novels. And neither of these is a novel. These are collections of, prose pieces, very different one from the other, but they both have to do with some kind of poetics of the fragment, either intentional or unintentional. So perhaps just a few words on, what are these two books? What is Il mestiere di vivere and what is I Dialoghi con Leucò?
Yeah. Okay, so, the sottotitolo here, it's say journals, but we can say that the craft of living is not simply a journal. Also, finding a title for this book was kind of a job in itself because the Italian mestiere can be translated in many ways, and it is a job, but more as an artisanal kind of job, and it's also a profession, but also like a mission in some ways, and so I think the craft is the best way of rendering it into English. It is basically, a collection. So Pavese, I have to say this, Pavese was very precise about what he wrote. He kept copies of the letters he sent when he was 14 or 15. So, he was kind of maniac about that. A kind of philologist too, because, he kept all this written material available. And after he died, he left all the mainly handwritten notes of this book ready to be published. He chose the title, Il mestiere di vivere. And so, when you read it, it is a diary, it is a journal, of course, it is very intimate, very personal. But as Julian was saying before, it also reveals, this hidden part of Pavese's personality. There are very harsh parts, especially very misogynistic parts. There are parts, and we can talk about this later, but also we restored some parts that were cut off in the first edition when there were blasphemy, parolacce, curse words. And so, it's kind of a miscellaneous collection of thoughts and of different parts of, I would say, Pavese's personality.
Do you think that the inclination to have parolacce was influenced by the Americans he was reading and what was happening in American literature, and the New Yorker finally letting bad words in with Mailer, I think?
I don't know. I think the Piedmontese had more of an influence than that. Yeah.
Especially in the blasphemy, I would say. Yeah. Totally.
The dialogues. The dialogues are 27 philosophical, really existential dialogues between gods and heroes of Greek mythology. And what each of them does is take a kind of neurotic, sidelong look at the myth. So the stories are all slightly adjacent. They're not the myths themselves. They refer to the myths, and they do what the myths never do, which is get into the deep psychology and the sort of moral and emotional consequences of what all those guys went around doing in their bloody heroic stories. I think that's my description. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think you kind of both, the three of you, in a way, gave very clear definitions of two texts which are fairly complicated for different reasons. I mean, I guess that one could argue that Il mestiere di vivere, perhaps, when one gets to read it, I mean, the complexity is not so much in the style. The style is, of course, beautiful and, crafted in a way which is conducive to reflection. But I think the Dialoghi are undoubtedly a difficult text. I mean, unpacking the Dialoghi requires a lot of interaction with the author. Both texts, I think, ring a bell to many Italian readers, but also non-Italian readers, bringing up a name, which is, perhaps going to be a little scontato to everybody. But, I cannot avoid thinking of Leopardi for two main reasons. On the one hand, of course, one could argue that Il mestiere di vivere is a form of a Zibaldone, right? I mean, then, of course, it has been growing in a way which is perhaps more structured than the chaotic magma of the Zibaldone. At the very same time, one could argue that the Dialoghi are indeed, in the tradition of this Italian philosophical prose, which has in the operette morali, a very important precedent. And of course, in the case of the Dialoghi, one could also go backwards in time, the classical tradition, the dialogues of Lucian, and so there's a very sort of a sophisticated line to which Pavese is kind of contributing. So I'm wondering whether you can say in different ways, and thinking of the two different texts, something about what these two works have told you or taught you about Pavese's interaction with, the tradition, broadly meant.
Yeah, well, I think that Pavese interacts with different traditions. he really, the first part of his career was marked by his work as a translator, in particular of English language texts into Italian. So that was a big influence on him. And I would say that one of the most interesting parts of reading The Craft of Living is not reading it from the first to the last page, but actually sort of jumping through, thanks to the index that we had to work on. That's the last thing that we worked on. And you can really find references to all his influences, all the things that he was reading, that he was annotating, that he was translating. So look up Leopardi in the index and you'll find several different references. He does reference the Zibaldone directly and other inspirations that you don't necessarily immediately associate with Pavese. There's a lot of references to Shakespeare, Dante, and of course we have the title of the Secretum Professionale, which is the first part of the book, that is a Petrarchian reference.
Yeah, that's true. And so I think that what also Vaccanio mentioned in his video is that what you can really perceive by reading this text is how Pavese was deeply, I would say, made off in some way by literature. So for him, you can really see that this was not only something extremely, extremely serious and relevant for him, but also a kind of the way he approached life. And we don't want to tonight, you mentioned Leopardi. Leopardi is mentioned also with references to the suicide, and Pavese committed suicide. But it is said that one of the reasons why Pavese committed suicide was that, he considered himself done as a writer. And so these, when he perceived that the literature was extinguishing its power in him, he said, okay, I don't have anything more to say, and he left. And so I think that by reading these notes, which, by the way, you're correct in saying that there is an order. Pavese established an order to read through them. He worked and reworked these notes. You can see add moving parts and this kind of stuff. And so, but yeah, the main thing you can perceive, I think, is the way in which Pavese interpret literary traditions. Very different literary traditions, by the way.
It's interesting. I have two main thoughts. One is that I have translated both Tabucchi and Umberto Eco, and they are both writers who make a lot of references, make a lot of literary references in slightly different ways, but it's always as if it's always on the skin level of the text when there's a reference to another writer. When I was working on the Pavese, I would stop in the middle of the sentence and I'd look up something and it would bring me to a reference, but it was never a straight line, and it was never something where there was some big flag that said, you need to look up Leopardi now. It was like I would meander my way to something that suddenly I realized he was in conversation with. But it was almost like I had to go in backwards and find my way there. So it's a very different kind of reference. And that's one thing that strikes me is that he's not, I think he is a show-off, but there's a way in which he's not a show-off about his literary references. I think you might have different, at least in my book. And the other thing that I think is that one of the things that's always driven me crazy about Greek myths is how they have nothing to do with people. They're not people stories, and so they seem more like comic books to me. It's interesting because Pavese's people don't have much to do with people either. They're ideas. There aren't. We were talking about neorealism in the last panel. There's nothing about there are things about human life, but it's not because it's the people, it's because there are these ideas that are exquisitely, painfully human and beautiful, but they exist almost hanging in space rather than belonging to, say, a character the way they might in a novel or with another writer.
Thank you. I mean, this is, of course, extremely important. And in a way, it reflects back even on the case of Il Mestiere, because, both books are not traditional in the sense of telling a story, right? I think even the Dialoghi, of course, you can, as you were saying very beautifully, perceive the sort of almost skeleton of a story. But really what he does is that there's this metamorphic element, which is extremely beautiful, and I think you described it so well. But, even then with Il Mestiere, we kind of keep adjusting our perspective because, once you move through the various entries, so to speak, they kind of, are metamorphic in a way. So perhaps, one question which brings us back to the craftish dimension of translation. If you can share some thoughts about the true challenges of working with these two texts specifically. I mean, of course, you all have experience with many other works, but the specific sort of, difficulties which the experience of Il Mestiere and I Dialoghi brought up.
Yeah, well, to begin with, the text was... It's a very challenging text, and I certainly would not have been able to translate this if I hadn't had a Iuri Moscardi at hand for all the many, many, many doubts that the text keeps throwing at you. Pavese has an interesting way of writing this text. He's speaking sometimes in first person as himself, but sometimes he's speaking in second person to himself. And sometimes it happens within the same sentence that he jumps from one to the other, because as much as he did sort of craft and recraft this text, I think he wanted to leave it a little bit murky as to how he is, who the audience is. He's writing it for us, but to himself in a certain sense. So that was definitely a challenge to begin with. Of course, as Iuri mentioned, the text keeps cross-referencing itself. So you'll get to the end of an entry, and it will say something like, "This is the opposite of what I was saying in October 24th," or whatever. And so then it forces you to sort of go back and make sure that the terminology is matching. He uses small portions in other languages. He uses English a lot, and it's often incorrect. So that was a difficult task as a translator. What do we do? Do we keep the English and add a footnote, which is what we ended up doing, because there's the alternative of correcting Pavese that I didn't feel I was competent enough to do or worthy. And then, of course, the text has, there are moments in which he is very colloquial, talking about his personal life, his relationship with friends and lovers, or women that he would have liked to be a lover of, but wasn't. And then there are entries that are very difficult to access because he is talking about maybe some ethnographic French book that he's been reading, and he's quoting page by page and giving complicated analyses of, and he jumps from one to the other. So that is one of the hardest things to do, and it was definitely a challenge to try to move into a different language, something written by someone who was so careful of other languages to begin with. And to this, I would add that there's really two phases in the book that have to do with Pavese's life. The first part of the book, most of it included in what we could call the first chapter that's called Segretum Professionale, takes place, he wrote it while he was in exile in Confino. He had been exiled by the fascist regime between, 35 and 36, down in southern Italy. So it's hard to not keep in mind the fact that this is Pavese under difficult circumstances, writing about his thoughts about life, about poetry. It seems like he's almost looking back at his career, even though at that point he hadn't really published anything yet. And then there's Pavese, who returns to Turin, and there's the war years and the post-war years, and he positions himself also with his work at Einaudi, the main, one of the main Italian publishing houses. So.
Okay, so the hardest part of this translation was finding the voice, which is something that often comes to me the way I think people think a muse comes to you. It's often kind of a very easy process that's close to sort of method acting, or I sort of feel like there's a place where I embody whoever the author is that I'm working on, and have a voice that is very clear to me, sometimes from the get-go. This voice was not clear to me from the get-go, and I've never wrestled with a voice this much. And someone had asked about the temporal bridge of translation in the last panel. And that was one of the things that, in particular for this book, I always had in mind that Pavese, in his way, is pulling from, ancient Greek texts into, mid-century, somewhat local Italian. And then how do I take that representation and mirror it and create a contemporary American voice that would somehow contain all of those things. Also, it took me forever to figure out, to get into his body in the way that I feel so easy with so many other writers, in part because I think he didn't have a body; he was just a head, and it was filled with things, and I didn't know what they were, and they were often quixotic, they were often private. There were, as everyone knows, there are sort of private symbols that replay throughout Pavese's work, and he's got his own code of what things mean. He's got his own semiology of himself, and then other times he's not using his semiology. He's just gone off, but he still has some sort of equivalency in mind. And I didn't know what any of it was, and I didn't have a Iuri. We just met. I wish I had a Iuri. I just had me, and so finding the voice for me was a process of trying to figure out what it felt like to invent these dialogues from the ground up. If I were Pavese in inventing one of these dialogues, but I'm me today, what voice would I, me, Pavese, then me, now use in this language? It was incredibly difficult. It was challenging.
Yeah, and actually, this is of course also, to my mind, very compelling, this argument about finding the voice. And of course, it's a beautiful metaphor for us readers when we read enjoying either the original or beautiful translations. But it's certainly a very important question for the translator who's channeling someone else's voice through their own voice. And so I think both the Mestiere and I Dialoghi are very polyphonic in a way, because as Julian was describing so brilliantly earlier, in the Mestiere we have these multiple voices of Pavese talking to himself or talking to someone, the audience, and then of course in the Dialoghi, the polyphony is perhaps more overtly there because we have multiple voices of the characters talking, and yet the ambiguous way in which the voice of the author runs across all of them raises all sorts of questions. So perhaps this is a question, and I would like to make the most of Iuri's expertise as a Pavese scholar, this question of polyphony, because it seems to me that while one can argue that polyphony is always there, and that even the romanzi, the regular romanzi, do have a significant amount of polyphony, I'm wondering whether you can tell us something, more specific about these two works, perhaps in the context of this discussion of voice, the voice of the fragmented or refracted voice of Pavese.
Well, now I feel very under pressure, but for sure you're right, and I would like to add something that it is that in the Mestiere di Vivere you can find sometimes Pavese transcribe his own dreams. And I found this extremely fascinating about the question you just asked me, because being a writer, he was extremely fascinated by dreams because he thought they were both a narration in which he himself, as a dreamer, was both the author but not very conscious about it. So it's a story that you are authoring in some ways, but at the same time you are not, you don't have a rational control over it. And I think that this could resonate with what you were saying about the voices. Pavese, I think it was an extremely aware writer, and for aware I mean a writer aware of the relevance of adapting the voices, the tones of his characters first to what they really should portray. And the more and more I read it, and you guess I read it many times, I discover how good, how great he was in the 30s or in the 40s. He wrote this novel in which we have peasants, so not educated people, which was totally different from the mainstream Italian literature of the time. But these characters remain both understandable to the general public and still extremely regional or local, so the way Pavese wanted them to be. And I think that the more and more I read and study Pavese, and it's fascinating, every time I read or reread Pavese, I discover maybe weird or only in my mind connection with the general, his general work or other literary trends. But the more and more I read and I study him, I discover how important the American literature was for him. This is something that Pavese declared many times, but still, I also think that he, especially after the war, he declared himself not interested in politics at all. But in this case, he was wrong. I mean, because with this book that he translated in the 30s and the 40s, he really established a cultural politics, but not limited only to what we read or only literature, but really the fact that in a time when under fascist regime, extremely hierarchical dictatorship, we say, he translated a book. He made a translated book like the Spoon River Anthology, in which everybody can really talk, and everybody has the same right to be listened to as any other. And that was, if you really think about it, it was extremely revolutionary for the time. And this happened with the Spoon River. This happened with Moby Dick, which was really an extremely hard challenge for him. And never forget that Pavese was animated by this passion, and he, made this huge and very relevant work for a very low, paying, only because he really wanted this book to be read and to be known by Italian readers.
It's familiar.
But I think that he was extremely aware of these, probably because he himself was, focused on this aspect of different voices, but also, Americans and American literature had a huge influence on this, for sure.
Which brings me to ask a question primarily to our translators, but of course, Iuri, you can, I'm sure, sort of chime in as well. You are also readers, right? Not only translators and writers. And I'm wondering to what extent this awareness, the fact that Pavese was in constant dialogue with your target language in the translation in a way. I mean, he was in constant dialogue with especially American literature. Has this played a role at all in your way of thinking about how to tackle the translation process? It's totally legitimate to say, no, it hasn't, but I'm curious because, of course, it's a very peculiar case of an author who was a translator and who was especially, familiar, conversant with the language into which you are translating. I mean, I'm imagining that a translator of Pavese into English feels more pressure than translating Pavese into other languages, for the reasons that it was a language with which he had a particularly strong attachment.
Yeah. I would say that I definitely approached this text in a very different way from how I would have approached one of his novels, say The Moon and the Bonfires. That's a text that I think owes a lot to English language, American literature sort of style of narration. I think we decided to approach Mestiere a little bit more with slight more reverence, I think, to the way that he was actually constructing the sentences themselves, because of the fact that it's polished, but it feels less polished than his novels. Okay, and so because of that, I tried to leave it in the sort of syntactically as close as possible to what he was going for in the original Italian. I didn't want to turn things around too much because of the way that I think a reader should receive the text.
I don't think that his being a translator into American or out of American played a role at all. In the sense that I couldn't feel that. I mean, obviously, I do all this stuff by feel rather than diligent research, but I couldn't, the way you can in the novels, couldn't feel the influence of any American text or even syntax. In fact, what I came to realize was how blasphemous it would be to adjust Pavese's syntax under any circumstances, and I think that would, if were I doing the Mestiere, I think I would have exactly the same response as you would with one of the novels. He puts the words where he does so intentionally that unlike some writers where you feel like, well, to get exactly what they mean, I have to move this into English syntax. And here I was really faithful to his syntax in a way that I'm not normally, which of course makes it harder because it still has to sound natural. But I think that if I had any inclination that the American literature would be one of the voices, I couldn't find it. I couldn't find any of those places. So.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense, especially because my feeling again. I think there's nothing wrong about discussing in terms of feeling because it's really what literature is about in the end, right? I mean, as readers, as translators, as authors. I mean, I don't want to romanticize it, but feeling are really crucial, and so I kind of trust the feeling of the translator way more than Of course, due diligence is needed and research is needed, but still, the kind of process has to do a lot with feeling. And I'm wondering, this is perhaps my last question before perhaps we can hear a little bit of both translations. But I want to ask something which is primarily for Minna, but I think it kind of goes back to in Mestiere as well. And it kind of stems from a previous conversation which we had today in the panel about poetry. We were discussing about Anne Carson in particular with Patrizio Ceccagnoli, and I think there was a strong point made about the fact that the poet is not necessarily interested in clarifying things or having them clarified through translation. Now, I Dialoghi con Leucò are not poems, yet it's a very poetical kind of text in all possible senses of the term poetical. And there are so many, at least, if I think about reading it in Italian, I find so many spots of ambiguity, so many gaps in terms of sense. It's hard to make sense of things in many instances. In a different way, this applies to Il Mestiere as well. And so I'm wondering how you translators, have you dealt with these gaps? You feel that you managed to leave them in a way up there for interpretation. Did you feel the need here and there, perhaps in a non-systematic way, to fill those gaps? Because of course you also have in mind another kind of audience. What's the sort of thing with gaps?
Okay, the thing with gaps. The thing with gaps is, at a certain point, Jill, my editor, floated the idea of publishing this with facing text, facing bilingually. And at first I was horrified because I do mostly prose, and the idea of having a whole bunch of people who also speak Italian and also have ideas about what words should go where, the idea of giving them all this fodder to criticize me seemed terrifying. And then the more I thought about it, the more I loved the idea. And the reason I loved the idea was because it's a way of asserting that this is not a novel. This is not something that you just read casually. You have to sit with these texts, and so I came to think of them as prose poems. And if they're not prose poems, they should be read the way that you would read a prose poem. And in that sense, the gaps are part of the music. They're essential. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we approach the gaps with a lot of footnotes. We have a lot. How many footnotes do we have? Hundreds.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of references to things that not even an Italian audience today would catch, let alone foreign audience references to, from the simple references to people in which he just puts a capital letter and we're supposed to know who he's talking about, and to just literary references, historical references. So I think we made a book that is accessible to people who don't know what Pavese is talking about. We prefaced the book with a long chronology of events in Pavese's life in Italy at the time, and a few world events that have some implications in the text. So a little bit more scholarly approach, I'd say.
Yeah, also because I remember clearly Luigi saying that we should provide a translation that was understandable even to, I don't know, a barber in Korea who can speak, who can read English. So, it has not to be, it must not to be too scholarly, but nevertheless it has to be clear. So we couldn't leave many gaps or blanks. And also we restore many of the ones that were missing in the translation. So it was also reconstructing a puzzle, of pieces of the puzzle, putting them back to where they belonged.
So, as a test, we should bring it to our common barber and see whether they get it. Okay, so I would say I would love, of course, to leave some time for Q&As from the audience, but, I always like to hear the sound of a text, in a new language, different language. Would it be possible to just hear a few lines of Il Mestiere and the dialogues, you're choosing?
Should we start? Okay, I think I should read probably this, since it does reference this is written. What Pavese does is kind of on December 31st or on January 1st of each year, he kind of summarizes a bit what the year was like, what happened, and I think. This is interesting. It's very short. It's January 1st, 1946, and he's he's sort of recapping a little bit what happened in the past year. So he says, and this year as well has passed. The hills, Turin, Rome. You blew it with 4 women. You got a book printed, wrote some good poems, and discovered a new form that weaves together many different threads. Circe's dialogue. Are you happy? Yes, you are happy. You have strength, genius, and something to do. You are alone. You almost committed suicide twice this year. Everyone admires you, showers you with praise, and dances around you. So what? Don't forget that you have never fought and never will. Do you mean anything for anyone?
I am completely unprepared for this. I have read occasionally from the dialogue, Endymion's dialogue, but I think I will read just a couple of exchanges from Seafoam, which is the dialogue between Sappho and Britomartis. And you'll have to, it's a dialogue, so it's really hard to read. So this is Sappho. And you do have to imagine that Sappho is just sort of floating. She's Seafoam, and she's just sort of floating on top of this gentle current. It's monotonous here, Britomartis. The sea is monotonous. You've been here ages. Don't you ever get bored? Britomartis. I know you liked being mortal better. Being the foam on a wave isn't enough for you, and yet you were seeking death. This death. Why? I didn't know it would be like this. I didn't know it would be like this. I thought everything would end when I jumped. I thought my desire and restlessness and all my turmoil would disappear. The sea swallows. The sea annihilates. That's what I told myself. And Britomartis responds, everything dies in the sea and is reborn. Now you know. Yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing. It's always fascinating to really hear, these new voices. And we do have time for questions from the audience. So let's open it up. I'm sure that our presenters, the 3 of them, will be happy. Yes, I think we have a mic here.
We have someone coming.
Okay.
There is someone.
Oh, thank you for this. First of all, thank you for this utterly fascinating conversation, presentation, the 4 of you being on stage and sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. I, first of all, want to compliment Julian for not being a traditore. Too often we hear traduttore, traditore, and you, having left the originals as they were and put footnotes, or used footnotes, crosses out traditore. And that's a rare and worthy of admiration trait and way of doing the craft. Well, actually, translating is a craft almost as difficult as the craft of living. I would have to think to formulate a question. So instead, I would like to show everybody, I'll turn around, this T-shirt because I'm an NYU alumna. I triple majored in Romance languages, and then I worked as a translator. So the New York Public Library was absolutely vital. And you folks know of the Donnell branch, which no longer exists, but that was crucial to have. So this is a library T-shirt. They actually come up with a new one every year, and I buy them every year. It's $5 that goes to the library, no tax. Just $5 to the library. So I'll turn around to show, and it, the back of it also says something, worthwhile. And here I'll shut up and pass the mic to whoever has a question.
Thank you, Elisabetta. Thank you very much for sharing. We have.
Thank you, everyone. I have a question for Minna. You said that your mom is the person that inspired you to translate this book. Does she have a favorite myth that she was reading over and over, or like more than one she was obsessed with, from the dialogues or from Greek mythology in general? Was she very close to some kind of myth?
My mother was a musician and a composer who was obsessed with literature, and I don't know if anyone remembers. There was this book. What's his name? De Crescenza, the guy who. Yeah, that guy. I think she was reading him at some point, which might have led her to the Pavese, although she was always interested in the Pavese. But she spent time in Italy when she was a young woman and studied music. And so the way that she kept up with that in her life was to read. And so she always was reading in Italian, and sometimes it was slow and sometimes it was fast. It was not one of the myths at all. It was much more likely the music of his language that she was responding to, and I think the way that it's both that it both has a kind of melody and is also very harsh. And there's a kind of hardness to it that I think, so the mix of those two registers, I think, was very interesting to her. So I don't know, did I answer your question? Okay.
One question over there, and perhaps another then.
All right, thank you all. So I was especially struck when you all were talking a little bit about syntax and readability as, these sort of two, let's say, contrasting demands sometimes. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but here I go. I am interested if there's something that comes to mind, and if not, that's fine. Maybe you could just expound on it more generally. But that's such an interesting point to me when you're having to sort of make this decision, especially if a writer has a very unique but let's say important syntax. Are there places where you really you could maybe even recall in the work where you had to make some sort of decision where had you not been doing this for, let's say, the preservation of Pavese's voice, you might have gone a different way, but you really said no, this is how it ought to be. It's awkward. However, I think this is what it would be, because that's so fascinating to me.
You have one ready, because I don't have one.
Well, I don't know if you know the book, but each dialogue is prefaced by a little bewildering paragraph. The syntax of the bewildering paragraphs, as well as the register, as well as the speaker, as well as the purpose, was probably the biggest mystery of the book for me. And in a way that they're set up as if they're going to tell you something, like set up the dialogue the way they appear on the page, but they often don't do anything like that. And they're often delivered in a very a kind of lofty register. And sometimes they're a little mean, and sometimes, but there's a lot of, it's lofty, and then at the same time he's saying yada, 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 you know. I kept wanting to adjust the syntax because I wanted to make them make more sense than they do. I really wanted to fix them more so that I felt confident in the decisions I was making. So I would say that, and then I was very strict with myself when at the very end I went back and I said, oh, he ends this sentence with more. It has to end there. He has 6 M dashes. We have to have M dashes because there aren't a lot of M dashes, and so that would be a place where I say I really wrestled with the syntax problem.
Yeah, I don't have a specific example, because I would say most of the book would be an example because we're just. Yeah, well, Iuri was mentioning that there are a couple of moments that are actually in the Piedmontese dialect, and obviously we translated that as if we were just translating it regularly into English, and then put a footnote saying this part was in dialect. But no, I don't have a specific quote that I could come up with here.
I think we have a question from Luigi. Can we get the mic down here?
No, it's okay.
It's for the recording.
It's for the recording.
I don't know whether it's a sort of a thought that occurred to me that the two books are perhaps closer than it looks at first sight. If I'm not mistaken, there's a sort of a pervasive nostalgia in the dialogues for a battle that could not be activated anymore. That is to say, many of these heroes are battling with monsters. You remember in the Iliad, Nestor is always saying to Achilles and all the other big guys, why, you don't know what really life was, you know, when you had to fight the Hydra, the lions and so on. Now you're fighting men, you know. But so there is an underlying nostalgia, which I think Pavese interpreted himself in the diary. That is to say, there's a devotion to the task of and to the centrality of literature that perhaps for us it's hard to imagine today, you know. But when Pavese was around, literature was debated on daily newspapers, and it was a matter of blood and sweat. You know, it was so central, and that's why I think Pavese stops when he commits suicide, when he says, "This is it." You know, I lived this negative experience because literature is basically motivated by an impossibility. That is to say, the impossibility of fighting with the monsters. And you can only keep that fight going for a while, you know, but you cannot bring it forever. It's also, let's not forget that besides being a translator, and a heroic one at that, because we're talking about a time when people had no clue of what the English language sounded like. And in fact, there's a beautiful book of his correspondence with Mr. Cuminato in Chicago, where he makes long lists of expressions and books and words that he doesn't know the meaning of. And Cuminato glosses them over, sends them back between Chicago and Torino. But he was also an editor. And he's the one who brings to Italy the culture that other countries have had all along. And Italy had not, because of the fascism, had blocked it. So here we go with anthropologists. Levi-Strauss comes to Italy. The Frankfurt School comes to Italy. And it's incipient. It's not that the following generation, the Eco generation, would be familiar with it. But Pavese is the one who intuits the importance of that kind of thinking. And I believe that the idea of finally delivering the dialogues as his last book at the end of the craft of living, it embodies this particular passion and this divine frustration that literature is all about. I mean, it is a frustration, and it's an impossible frustration not to be carried on. So, one question I do have. I'm sorry for being so verbose, but why Leucothea and not just Leucò?
Titles. I thought that I think a lot about how American readers both will say things and how they will read things, like what it will look like to their eyes. Leucothea looks like a goddess. And to an American, Leucò doesn't. And in fact, it doesn't look like anything. It doesn't even register as a name necessarily. And so I had a couple of different ideas about how to do it, although I don't think I ever had Leucò as one of my options. Early on, I had thought it has to be Leucothea. And I was trying out all these titles, and then I realized I spent a weekend visiting a translator friend, and we were talking about Pavese the whole time, and we just kept calling it the Leucothea dialogues. We just kept referring to it.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, Leucò only works in Italian because it's colloquial. It doesn't exist. It's like if I were to say Eugenio.
Exactly. That's an important point, though. I mean, don't you think? First of all, it's masculinizing a female character to begin with, which is sort of a difficult, especially in our time, this ambiguity, let's call it, or duplicity of. And I think Pavese had this tendency to familiarize myths, in a sense. It's like saying Virgin Mary and call her Mariuccia or something like that. It's just there is a tendency to vernacularize the myth. But in any case, it's a choice like just any other.
I will note, I agree that I've done a little betrayal, and I don't have footnotes. But I think that the introduction that I wrote is super ultra vernacular, and how. Yeah, no. I mean, but in a way, the introduction has that kind of Leucò thing. It has that swagger that is missing from the titles. So even though I couldn't do it exactly, and obviously I thought about it, but I do think that voice that is encapsulated, I think I put it in the introduction. So, yeah.
Well, on this, I think, in spite of the little betrayal, I'm happy to mention something which I forgot to mention at the very beginning, and is the fact that Minna, with this translation, just won the PEN Translation Prize. So I think she deserves a special round of applause. And I was so eager to get into hearing you guys talk, and I forgot to, again, come up with formalities, but congratulations. And I would like to thank the three of you, Julian Sachs, Iuri Moscardi, and Minna Zallman Proctor, for sharing your work with us. It's been a truly provocative conversation. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us.